So it is July 4th, 2020. On this day, the United States commemorates the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, declaring independence from Great Britain. The first lines of the Declaration of Independence are thus: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it." So, though the Declaration of Independence it's not the Constitution, it's not binding as law, but it implies things. It implies things for American culture to promise to the American people that it is not going to break these. And some of the laws in the Bill of Rights, they are based on the principles outlined here. Our culture, our laws are often designed around this, at least in some respects. But it's a general principle that a government becomes illegitimate if it's not acting from the consent of the governed. And it's also built into some state constitutions that people have the right to abolish their governments, that they have a right to revolution. If government becomes destructive to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, if government does not act from the consent of the governed, then the people have a right to alter and abolish their governments. So, is the United States right now acting in any way that is destructive to these ends? I would argue that right now the government doesn't really take care of the people. I mean, we did get a stimulus check, but are we able to really take care of ourselves right now? They are sending people back to work. They're sending people back to work in a pandemic. I mean, really. And most people, they can't handle the $400 emergency. I mean, people are getting desperate to work, but the money's still there. The money is still out there. There's plenty of food to go around. We currently, I would tell Karl Marx that right now we have more houses than we need. We have more food than we need. And we have billionaires living on their yachts. And most people can't handle a $400 emergency. Most people can't handle their medical bills, their rent. People have to choose between whether to buy heat or buy food. And it's not just a few of us, it's many Americans. Some people are living in their cars. I I do have my own place, but it's currently unlivable, so I have to stay with my family. But let's not just talk about poverty in general at this point. Let's talk about nations that live within the United States. Let's talk about black nations, such as African Americans and Somalis. Let's talk about Latino nations and Native Americans. So, black nations. The most prominent black nation in the United States, I would say, is African American. And the prominent African American population tends to inhabit from southern Virginia down towards Atlanta and west around Louisiana, Arkansas, a little bit in Texas, Mississippi. You'll find on a map, on demographic maps, you will find a belt of black majority counties. This is known as the Black Belt. Look up the Black Belt. Maybe not so much in Texas, but there are counties with significantly high African American populations in Texas. Now, within the United States, there are cultural differences, and sometimes these cultural differences include racial differences. Sure, there may be individuals who move from one culture to another, but you look at dialect differences, look at religious denominations, and voting records, and the Black Belt shows up on that too. Maybe not on denomination differences, but dialects are different. It's because of segregation, and there are some people who speak African American vernacular English who are not black, and there are some people who are black who do not speak African American vernacular. But pay attention to these cultural differences, and you'll see that the interest of one culture, community, does not always align with another community. Especially on voting records. The Black Belt usually does not vote the same way as the rest of the states that it runs through. That is very important. Even after the marches of MLK, after the Voting Rights Act, the states still continued to vote in ways that denied the Black Belt, the African Americans, their rights. Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. isn't even a state. And through most of the 20th century, probably all of the 20th century, it has been majority African American, and it's always votes for the Democrats. But it's denied the 2 senators. It's allowed to have a seat in the Electoral College. That's it. A non-voting representative. It has a population larger than Wyoming, but it's denied representation. Now, sometimes Virginia will elect Democrats. Sometimes North Carolina will elect Democrats. But for the most part, with this whole winner-take-all system, it's unheard voices. And we see the South as always voting Republican. And there's so many people in the South who do not vote Republican. Latino. There is a large island with a large population in the Caribbean, Puerto Rico. It's only allowed to send one non-voting representative to Congress. It could easily send 3, maybe 5. I don't remember the exact population of Puerto Rico, but no 2 senators. It's perhaps it could be autonomous, or it could be a state, but the way it is right now, it's not given. The population is not represented. We had Rick Santorum say, "Well, you have to speak English." Well, everyone speaks English there. That's just downright bigotry, you know. You can speak Spanish in the United States. Come on, you can speak Spanish in any state. You can find the United States doesn't have an official language. I'm from Maine, and French and English are co-official here. Not technically official, but neither is official. But Maine is de facto, it's bilingual. From southern Texas to southern California, there's a belt of majority Latino population, and Spanish is widely spoken there. People there are mostly Catholic, and they mostly have Spanish, Mexican American names. They're mostly mixed race. And likewise, like African Americans, they tend to vote more center-left, far-left. But in some of these areas, Texas is almost always voting for a Republican. Yeah, Texas has a lot of electoral college representation because of its population. And if half the population votes Democrat, but the Republican wins, then Texas sends all of that to Republicans. Now, Arizona, the same way. New Mexico and California almost always consistently vote for Democrats, though. But yeah, here we got a large state, a state that used to be its own country, and it's still bullying out its African American population and its Latino population, and just representing itself as it's just painting itself as just a white state, just a white southern state with its white southern culture. And we don't see this other side of Texas that does exist. Texas could be many states, but I'll get into that. And then Native Americans. Pause the video and go look at a map of Alaska. Look at a demographic map of Alaska by county, racial demographic, and look at a map of an electoral map of Alaska. Pause the video, you see what you see. So, as you see, northern Alaska almost always votes for Democrats, and the counties there are majority Native American or Inuit. And southern Alaska, the population almost always votes for Republican and is majority white. I mean, they're right there. You could have two states. The cultural divide's there. But what do we have? Well, we have colonizers. That's basically what people, white people moving west are colonizers. Imposing their say on the rest of the country. The Alaskan natives, they have been there for perhaps 30,000 years, and they have a different interest. I wouldn't argue that the Democrats perfectly represent these demographics, their interest, but as many people feel, it's the best that we've got. But I'll get into that later. Native Americans have been here 40, 30,000 years in some places, maybe longer. And Native Americans have established nations that the United States has treaties with, and the United States violates these treaties. Land has been just outright stolen, but stolen and colonized. And the rights of these nations just have not been respected. We didn't sign a deal with them to just use the land and just be allowed to live there and pay rent. It was just outright theft. And then just act like, this is our land. Our family has been here for a long time, and we were the first ones here. We discovered this. And, no, there were countries here. There are countries here. And we're living on top of those countries and just ignoring them. Those countries still exist. And those countries use the land to actually take care of their people, their tribes. That's what a tribe is. A tribe takes care of its people. Our country's nothing like that. Our United States, it does not take care of people. That's why Native Americans still fight to make sure that the tribes have the resources they need to take care of the people. We look at African Americans. African Americans take care of each other too. But they're denied the resources that they needed. After the Civil War, what should have happened was the people who violated the natural rights of the African Americans, they they should have provided them the land, the money that they need to own their own farms and build their own schools. The government should have sought to it. But instead, the North just apologized to the white South and let them take out their frustrations on African Americans. They let them have that land back, and they let those states back into the Union instead of maybe carving out states with black majority populations and allowing black representation in those states and allowing those states into the Union. Think about how many states there could be in the Black Belt, black majority states. Instead, we had the states that we had before. And then, you know what happened next? The South passed vagrancy laws. 10 of those states had laws on the books that made black people into slaves again. They required that all African Americans had to register for any job that they could get, that they could not they could not quit that job without going to prison. If they didn't have employment, they would go to prison. They would go to a labor camp. And they would have to accept whatever wage. Even if the boss wasn't paying wages, they would have to accept it. They weren't allowed to own certain things. They weren't allowed to own land. They weren't allowed to own weapons. So they're basically slaves again for the next 50 years until about World War I. They weren't even allowed to leave their states. Murders would go uninvestigated, lynchings, all that. Police brutality. That was a horrible time. Reservations. What happens when you have a country and almost all the land of the country is stolen, but a little bit set aside, not really enough to farm or hunt with? Your people are reduced to poverty. How is it that when you talk to white Americans about reservations, about African Americans living in the inner cities, they don't own anything? And you make fun of them for being poor? Or you say that the tribes just don't work and make people lazy, make people into drunks? How can you expect them to do anything when everything's been taken away? Have we really considered that if your ancestors had to face slavery, and then your ancestors had to face vagrancy laws, and then your ancestors had to face segregation and police brutality, and make no mistake about it, segregation is happening right now. It's not on the books, but how can you leave how can you leave a formerly segregated community when you don't have any money? If your ancestors inherited poverty and the millionaires who got rich off of the segregation and off of the slavery, they got to keep the money that they had from that, then what are you to do but to go get a job for the rich? And your job has minimum wage, and you can be fired for anything. And there's many other people who also need jobs who are the same color as you. You can get paid, but you're not going to become a millionaire. You're not going to gain any property. You're not going to end up owning a shop. Some people will, yes. But here's this guy. He owns all the land. You work for him. Have we failed to consider that Jeff Bezos, who has many African American employees, is still profiting off of the slavery in the 1860s? Jeff Bezos is profiting off of slavery. Let's also consider the Native nations have another issue that needs representation right now. I'm seeing that the United States and Canada are doing a little bit about this, but many missing women, many Native women are missing. Sold into slavery on the black market. The United States doesn't take care of the people. This isn't. This is people who exploit people who are vulnerable, and people who lack political representation and people who lack money are vulnerable. Let's consider other nations that the United States oppresses. The collective term is the Global South. Latin America, Southern Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, the Middle East. Are you familiar with the term Banana Republic? What it basically means is that the United States, American businessmen have their senators and their congressmen and in their pursuit of happiness, in their pursuit of material, they pressure their politicians, they inform their politicians that they need favorable business conditions in the Global South. They need governments that are favorable to business. They need people to work for them. So they petition their congressmen to support dictators. Yeah, dictators. A republic that represents a business interest. A republic. It's sort of like copying the government of the United States for these other countries. And the people in these other countries, they barely have a choice. They don't really have a choice. In Guatemala, there were indigenous cooperative farms that belonged to the tribe, farms that belonged to the people. But big banana companies in America wanted those farms to belong to corporations. So they had just downright brutal governments installed that murdered children. Guatemala was one of the worst colonized, the worst of the colonization of the United States. It is a colony. And it didn't just happen in Guatemala. It was attempted in Vietnam, but it failed. That's why people support communism in these countries in the first place, really. People are driven into poverty, so they become communist. So the government, yeah, the United States government does take care of the rich, gives them entire countries. But the United States government does not take care of indigenous women. Oh, I need you to back this tin pot dictator. I'll give your campaign lots of money. I need you to look into the disappearance of my mother and my sister. You don't have any money, get out of here. That's how this is. It's all about pursuit of happiness for the rich, for people who already have money, but it's not about life. Now, I tell you, yeah, people do vote for Democrats, and a lot of people who are voting for Democrats are not being represented. But people vote for Democrats because that's the lesser of two evils, really. When you really look into it, the Democrats are not a left-wing party. The Democrats do not really represent the people. The Democrats back the corporations, and they make the corporations a little easier to work for, a little minimum wage, more rights for disenfranchised people. But they still try to make the rich richer. And as you make the rich richer, they gain more power over the poor. It's backing people who already have money. It's not helping people form small businesses. It's not, I mean, there's a little of that. It's not really great at helping people form cooperatives. Right now, we have a choice between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, and quite frankly, they both suck. Two old white men with money who have said racist things, and they both show dementia or they're lying. So we don't really have much choice. I mean, consider that this country, New York, you could have 5 states, each with representatives and senators out of New York City. You could have entirely indigenous states. You could have states entirely of African American or mostly of African American. You could have Latino, Spanish-speaking states. And that would be a real alliance. But state boundaries do not necessarily correlate to cultural boundaries. Look around Pennsylvania, you have different dialects spoken by white people. That's not cultural boundaries. It's Pennsylvania. You could have many states carved out of California. These are lines. These lines on a map are not drawn by cultures. They are drawn by the bourgeois. Wyoming. I mean, just its white population could be part of a much larger state with just 2 senators. It. Why does it? Why does that white state get 2 senators? That tiny population get 2 senators, and New York City and several other cities also only get 2 senators. It's not representing a nation. It's not representing a culture. It's just inflating the white USA culture. The Lakota Nation, it is distinctly separate from the rest of North Dakota and South Dakota, but it doesn't get any senators. So yeah, and then it's all set up in a way so that there's 49 white majority states, almost always sending white senators who reflect the fist pump USA culture, and nobody else gets any representation. It's not. I mean, they say republic, not democracy. This isn't representing nations. It's just representing white nations, and just one white nation and that. I would argue that if we represented all the nations, particularly the most marginalized nations, then there would be a more far left representation in the Senate. Let's consider what Frederick Douglass. Look up Frederick Douglass's speech on the 4th of July. Frederick Douglass was a former slave who escaped, went to the North, and became a very prominent abolitionist, a writer, and a speaker. And he did not code his speech. He let white people know exactly what he was thinking, exactly what many black people were unwilling to say in front of a white person. And I'm not going to give his speech right here, but Frederick Douglass said that the 4th of July celebration exposed the hypocrisy of white America, and that the celebration, it's not shared by him, and it's not shared by his people. I think I have been long aware of how the United States treats people of color, and my thought when people got so pissy at Colin Kaepernick and what was that other guy's name? Black athletes, not all of them are black, but athletes who would kneel during the national anthem, I didn't see any disrespect in kneeling during the national anthem. That is still patriotic, and I tell you, I'm not patriotic. I would burn the flag. But when these athletes would kneel during the anthem and people got pissy, I replied back, why do you demand that a black guy be unquestionably loyal to that disgusting symbol of a country that abuses his people? When you are like so sensitive that they disrespect the troops who've done atrocities in many countries, and the police who abuse his people. What if the United States were treating you the same way? Would you still have loyalty to it? Did these people really fight for your freedom? The Civil Rights Act, yeah, it was signed. But still, just because black people can vote different than the rest of the South doesn't mean that they actually won the election, doesn't mean that they actually, I mean, once it became clear that black people were voting different, why didn't the rest of the South vote different too? Once you saw how black people were voting, why didn't you join them, you fuckers? If they protest, why don't you join them? To the man in Missouri, when the protesters broke open the gate to protest around the mayor's house, why weren't you already in the Black Lives Matter movement? When you found out that they were going to come to your gated community, why did they have to break the gate open? Why did you go out and invite them in? And why, instead of greeting them with guns? Why are you protecting your privilege when our history is very clear that people were abused? Why is it that the upper class in this country is almost entirely white? Think about it. If the upper class is almost entirely white, then nothing has really changed. Black people are not free. So they still have nothing to celebrate on the 4th of July, and you should be happy that they are kneeling for the national anthem. But really, perhaps they should be burning the flag instead. A lot of people they'll tell you what they want you to hear. They'll tell you what you want to hear, I mean. But there are some people like James Baldwin. He'll just outright say, he would have just outright said, George Washington's not one of his heroes. He knows who his heroes are. Some people are not loyal to the United States, and when you hear that, you get angry. Like, Oh, the poor troops! You must respect the troops! Even if they murder, you still have to respect them. And perhaps you should hear what they have to say. They tell you they're not loyal to the United States. Maybe the United States is the problem. What would this country look like if the United States, if America was doing the right thing? What would this country look like if everyone had freedom? It wouldn't look like this, really. There would be black majority states. There would be indigenous majority states and Latino majority states, all with representation. Washington would not be commemorated. Jefferson would not be commemorated, much less the Confederacy. Black and indigenous nations, they'd tell you who their heroes are, and they would be commemorated. Spanish would be co-official with English. If there's going to be official languages, Spanish is going to be one of the official languages. That shouldn't upset anyone.